We're getting critical mass, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. My name's Mike Egang, and I'm with the Rare Access Action Project. And today we're going to be discussing a PDAB paper that we had released this summer during the National Conference of State Legislatures annual legislative summit. And we're very pleased to have our panel with us this morning to engage in a discussion both of the issues, some of the key topics and themes that we found through the paper. And so we'd like to actually proceed with the program as planned. Next slide, Kelsey. So on our panel this morning, we have Jennifer Snow. Jennifer, as many of you know, has done a lot of economic work, policy work regarding both healthcare and federal and state policy. And she is the principal at Aptica. She is also our principal author. And so we will be turning a good portion of the time over to her for a discussion of the paper. We'd also like to welcome Bill Sorrell. Welcome, Bill. Bill is a professor of practice at the University of Maryland Francis Key Carey School of Law. A lot of K's in there.
A lot. Very challenging.
But welcome, Bill. Bill's also a patient advocate, and he is doing not only his teaching, but he is also supporting a number of patient groups and in the healthcare space, and particularly patient healthcare access issues. So welcome, Bill.
Thank you.
Bridget Dandros Surratt is with us as well. And Bridget, is very good to see you. Bridget is the founder of Advocates for Compassionate Therapy Now. She is also one of those very vocal advocates in Colorado. And Bridget has been a leader both at RAAP and nationally, helping to inform policymakers and stakeholders on the impact of PDAB, some of the unintended consequences, and how do we navigate those. So Bridget is a tremendous voice for many in the rare patient community, but also the broader patient community. And so welcome, Bridget.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
With that, just by way of also introduction, the Rare Access Action Project, we've been working on PDAB for a few years now, and often we'll get at the state level and we will engage in discussions with policymakers and stakeholders. We'll share with them our perspective and understanding of both the life sciences as well as the healthcare ecosystem, how that will impact patients. And people would look at us as if we were from another planet. And so we had engaged with Jennifer earlier this year to really build a paper that we could leave behind with policymakers that would, in very clear language, explain not only what a PDAB is, but how a PDAB would operate and how that operation could impact the access to a rare disease therapy. And so our goal here was really to produce something that could be used as an advocacy tool, both with legislative staff, with policymakers, and with other stakeholders to help better inform them on why this is an important area for us to consider for rare disease patients, and potentially the impact that PDABs could have on patient access to therapies, which, as many of you know, there's an enormous unmet medical need in the rare disease community for new therapies. And often the system currently throws up challenges and barriers to access. And so PDABs become another layer in that. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. So with that, I'd like to turn the time over to Jennifer to talk about the paper and talk about some of her key findings and her questions, and then we will open it up to a conversation with our panelists.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes trying to dive in deep into the worlds of Prescription Drug Affordability Boards, PDABs, and give you a great background on it for those of you who may not be as familiar with it, For those of you who are familiar, hopefully, it is a great refresher on this Monday morning. It's a great time, I think, to be diving into issues that affect, I think, all patient populations, but particularly those that are concerned with rare disease. It sounds like this week is going to be a doozy in terms of policy. So I'm glad to be able to be upfront on a Monday and capture your attention before it all goes to hell later this week. Depending on the direction that things go. But with that, let me dive in. Next slide. So for years, states have been grappling with ways to lower prescription drug costs. Not a surprise. About 10 years ago, we had a wave of pharmacy benefit management, transparency rules that kind of kicked around. And then there was a second wave of legislation that came through with manufacturer price transparency reporting requirements. Neither quite, I think, accomplished what people were hoping for in terms of getting to that lower drug price. And then the third wave of kind of what to do next started in 2019 with Prescription Drug Affordability Boards. There are 10 states with them currently. There were 11. I believe New Hampshire pulled back theirs this summer. But 10 states have moved forward with PDABs. And I will say, like, when you've seen one PDAB, you've seen one PDAB. They really do vary state to state in terms of what they look like, what they're set to accomplish, the rules around them. And we'll go into a little bit more detail, but I think, the concept of a PDAB sounds really intriguing. Like, how do we create an affordability board that looks at, prescription drug costs and really hones in on them and tries to make them more affordable? But I think, the theory has not met the reality. And that's because, getting to the heart of prescription drug costs is really, really hard. There is not kind of one answer that's going to get you towards affordability and towards lower drug costs. And, it's easy to set up a PDAB. It's really hard to create a win with it. The legislative win of having passed it is not the win in and of itself. And as Marilyn can tell you, it's been kicking around since 2019, and it hasn't really done anything yet in terms of implementation and saving anyone any money. And so that's a long runway of costs that have just not accomplished what they're looking to do. If we go to the next slide. So what is a PDAB, for those of you who may not be as familiar with it? PDABs, like I said, they vary by state, but in general, we're looking at 5 to 7 board members per state. They meet on a quarterly-ish basis, sometimes monthly, depending on how busy the state is. Their remits will vary by state. Some states are looking to reduce spending for Medicaid. Others are looking at employer health programs in the state. Others are looking at state and local government purchases. It really can vary. The process by which they go at it is fairly similar. They first kind of do a cost review and analysis where they're going to identify the high cost drugs. Maybe it's a list of 500 drugs that they're going to initially start with, and then they conduct affordability reviews. And then from there, they may look at patient out-of-pocket costs, and then they may analyze price and market data. They may look at therapeutic alternatives. Then they will eventually, once they kind of hone in on what they're looking at, they'll say, okay, what do we do with this information? And they may make policy recommendations to the legislature in the state. And then they'll have to say, well, what do we do with it? Do we create an upper payment limit? And we'll talk about that in a sec. And then they have to kind of determine how they're going to implement it. And we're still, like, no state has gotten past that sort of place. And then once you set up something, you have to monitor and evaluate it. So really not an easy process, because at each step, you're getting stakeholder engagement. It's a long process to kind of get from step to step. And again, once you even decide what to do, to implement it is really hard. So 4 states have decided, that they are going to do upper payment limits. And these are essentially price caps. What they're doing is they're setting a ceiling on what payers can pay for a drug. They do not dictate, because they're not allowed to dictate, what the price that a manufacturer can charge for it. And again, these are one-off drugs. So like in Colorado, they started with 5 drugs that they were looking at. And then I think Bridget, I'm going to look to you for a nod. I believe we're at 3 drugs that they kind of honed in on as unaffordable. And we're still kind of working on what that means for those drugs. But even if you take a look at those 3 drugs, like that's not, there's 2,500 people, I believe, on the 3 drugs in question in Colorado. It's a lot of effort for looking at 3 drugs. And even then, will an upper payment limit go to make any changes in terms of what patients actually pay? Because the question of affordability is a really hard one. Is it affordable to the state as a payer? Is it affordable to the patient? Those are 2 very different questions. Just taken, I'm just going to give a random example off the top of my head. If a drug costs $10,000 and you get it down to even, let's say, $1,000, you knock 90% off. You're just like, we're going to make it $1,000. And then there is a 25% coinsurance for the patient. Does that make it affordable for a patient? I don't know. I mean, I guess it really varies by patient, but does that change that for a patient? Does it make it more affordable for the state? Probably. But again, it's the question of affordability. And that question of affordability, by the way, varies by state. There's no one definition of affordability. So you have 10 different states grappling with what is affordable and how do you weigh that balance between what a state pays and what the patient pays, and how do you look at it? I'll go to the next slide. So I have done some of the modeling when it comes to the upper payment limit. And again, you're talking about 3 drugs in a state, and it doesn't change what the manufacturer can pay. So those savings, even if they're weighed towards the state, can really get lost in the shuffle of the dollar flow. And I'd be happy to work that out in an example for anyone who's interested at a later date. But you're talking about the money getting from the wholesaler to the pharmacy, from the pharmacy, from the payer to the pharmacy. And the most likely when you've done the survey work, you see the payers are like, yeah, it might go towards lower premiums. It might go to the patient, maybe, but it's a lot of work for a one-off drug that probably the savings will be eaten up within the system itself and not given to the patient. They're not going to see lower out-of-pocket costs in terms of patient affordability unless the state mandates that those savings be passed on. Most payers believe that premiums would actually increase with the use of upper payment limits because they're not getting necessarily the same rebates that they would get from the manufacturer. So if the manufacturer decides, hey, I'm going to play ball with this, I'm going to do an upper payment limit, it doesn't necessarily mean, it means that they may get less rebates. And so in the end, those savings are kind of taken by the system. And they could drive higher costs ultimately for a patient if they're forced to make up the difference between what the drug costs and the acquisition costs on the medical side, depending if it's a medical benefit or a pharmacy benefit. So really, from a patient affordability side, I think there's huge concerns about PDABs and being able to accomplish that mission. I think one of my bigger concerns is whether patients will be able even to get the drug. And that is because the use of upper payment limits makes huge assumptions about supply chain logistics. Will pharmacies be able to even purchase the drug at this lower price if they're not going to be reimbursed at the price that it costs it's costing them to acquire the drug? Like, will they be able to provide the drug? We're seeing the same parallels currently when it comes to the Inflation Reduction Act and Medicare Part D negotiated drugs being implemented in 2026. I believe it was 90% of pharmacies for the NCPA survey indicated that they may or may not, they're considering not having the drug in stock for Part D beneficiaries just because they'll be running at a loss. Pharmacies were expected to lose about $27,000 each per fiscal year because of the Part D negotiated drugs. And so there's that aspect of it. There's also payers may end up saying, you know what, if there is an alternative drug, we're going to prefer that drug because we're still going to be getting discounts and rebates on that other drug instead. So they'll be pushing towards that drug. And then you also have the question about, rare diseases in a very unique spot, already difficulty getting the drug. If they operate from out of state, will that state, will they be able to afford to be in state? Will the in-state pharmacies decide not to cover the drug if it is subject to a UPL? And so I think it really complicates matters from a rare disease standpoint already. You're talking about difficulty with access and affordability. If it is a medical drug, I will say that there is concerns that from a provider standpoint that, currently we're in an ASP plus 4.75% from the provider Medicare side. And so if that is kind of tampered with, if the add-on is tampered with, will provider reimbursement, will providers be able to afford to reimburse the drug, to provide the drug? Because provider reimbursement really does not equal the cost of the treatment. Provider reimbursement, they do count on that full ASP plus because of all the other, costs associated with providing the treatment. Whether it's, follow-up, whether it's discussions, whether it's storing, whether it's billing, whether it's all of it, it takes a lot to provide a drug, and it's more than that cost of the drug itself. And so I think overall, there's huge concerns with PDABs when it comes to patient access and affordability. Instead, if we go to the next slide, there's more immediate solutions that we should be looking at, I think, that work towards and matter to patients, such as removing barriers to access and doing a deeper dive on prior authorization, banning non-medical switches and step therapy. We're going to be seeing, I think, over the next few years as there's kind of a difficulties, particularly in Part D, but also future, like about step therapy and utilization management in particular, prior authorization. There's going to be more and more of it. And I think we need to be more aware of what it looks like and whether it's providing too big of a barrier to patients in terms of what's next and how to get their drug. So we need to be looking at that instead. We need to be looking at affordability changes, such as out-of-pocket caps, copay accumulator, or maximizer bans, eliminating alternative funding programs. These are things that are just really harming patients at the point of sale and preventing them from getting their drugs and preventing them from being adherent in the long term. We're moving towards a world of co-insurance rather than co-payments. And again, that is challenging patients. And, a non-adherent patient is going to end up costing the system more in the long run. And we need to be concerned about that today, not in the long run. In addition, we're worried about things like PBM reform and making sure that passes, requiring rebate pass-throughs, looking at state level or multi-state rare disease reinsurance programs, just to be able to collate and pull together that risk instead of having one-offs. And then I think, one of the great solutions would be to look and permit Medicare Part B, Medigap programs for Medicare eligible patients under the age of 65, be able to do more broad insurance coverage. And I think, Medigap is not necessarily given the respect that I think it deserves in this system, and particularly as we move to a heavily influenced Medicare Advantage world. Medigap really does serve a great population. I think it's kind of gotten shoved under the rug a little bit with the standalone PDPs and their challenges. But I think that we need to be encouraging Medigap for more patients, particularly those with rare disease who, count on affordable coverage moving forward. And PDABs, great idea. In concept, I totally understand why, but I think in execution, they're just not, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. That's everything I've got. I moved fast, but I'm happy to take questions, and we'll continue to talk about the challenges that we have here.
Thank you, Jennifer. So Bill and Bridget, we've had a kind of a big top line discussion about the paper itself. I'd like to turn just a few minutes over to each of you to maybe pull together or pull out some of your thoughts. And then I have some specific questions that we'll turn to on some of the topics that Jennifer actually dove into with us. So I'll turn a few minutes over to you, Bill, and then to Bridget.
Well, I thought the paper was absolutely fantastic to have brought together in such an effective and direct way what are the source of so many concerns, and to do so in the spirit, sort of an empathetic spirit. Yes, we know what you're trying to achieve, but unfortunately, here are all the reasons why it probably won't work out quite the way you wanted to. I think that's a very effective piece. It's written with the right tone, and that often, of course, is as important as the substance itself. I think I personally was most happy on the substance side to see the analogy drawn to what may be a train wreck on the Inflation Reduction Act in the next few months. I see this train heading down the tracks, and it looks like there's this other train that's coming towards it. And the analogy is really quite strong. Of course, as Jennifer was pointing out, one of the real bases for the whole PDAB exercise is the thought that, gee, the Inflation Reduction Act and creating these Medicare fair prices was a fantastic piece of policy. We need to grab that policy and drag it into those non-Medicare payers that we at a state level have influence over. And so the analogy is quite fair because it's in fact the basis in many respects for the policy. And unfortunately, I agree with Jennifer and RAAP and the paper that really the Inflation Reduction Act is a preview for what could go wrong and what unfortunately probably will go wrong in the context of PDABs. What does that mean? Well, I think that, the legislatures that have been advocates for PDABs understand that there is this risk that confronted with a non-market price, manufacturers could make the decision not to provide product into that state. And that was sort of the boogeyman that they acknowledged, but they moved forward, notwithstanding that concern, under the belief that they could sort of force manufacturers' hands. What I think Jennifer's paper illustrates is that's probably not the real source of risk in terms of jurisdictions being cut off from access. The real source of risk is that providers in the state will look at those prices, will look at the economic effect of those prices on them and say, I can't commit financial suicide here. I just can't do it. And that they will move to alternative therapies that remain high price, that remain high rebate oriented, that in fact will meet their economic needs. We can't change the rules of economics, unfortunately, at our whim. And the real danger here, I think, first for the IRA, but then subsequently for PDABs, is that providers will vote with their feet. And both CMS in the context of the IRA and PDABs in the context of their reviews of drugs for affordability purposes are shooting themselves in the foot from this perspective, because the premise of their analyses are these drugs are not special. There are therapeutic alternatives. So you're handing to the providers the rationale to say, well, okay, so there are therapeutic alternatives. I am not going to stock this product. I'm going to stock this product. And that means that we've done absolutely nothing for the affordability of either the payer or the patient. In fact, in many cases, we may be working against the existing economic place that both the payer and the patient enjoy. The law of unintended consequences is a law, and sometimes we just can't get away from it.
Thank you, Bill.
We have
Bridget?
Mike, we have a question in the chat about who is
Yes, we'll
supporting
get back to
PDABs,
that.
who's funding them.
We'll get back to that, Kelsey. Bridget?
Excellent. Hi. Yeah, absolutely. Just to kind of add on to what Jennifer and Bill have said, as a patient here in Colorado living with a rare disease, we watched our PDAB suggest that Trikafta for cystic fibrosis had alternative therapies. And if you know anything about Trikafta or cystic fibrosis, Trikafta is there as a therapy because it is for a specific genetic marker of CF, and there are 0 alternative therapies. And so our PDAB went through this very long and expensive process of deliberating over Trikafta, scaring all of the patients because Vertex did say it was going to stop selling Trikafta in Colorado just because there are so few Trikafta patients, only to realize that Trikafta was a singular therapy with no alternatives, and then they fortunately found it affordable. Unfortunately, they have gone ahead and placed a UPL, an upper payment limit, on Enbrel, and all the upper payment limit does is limit what your insurance can reimburse for that product. We already, given our mostly rural nature, have very few pharmacies that are able to stock this medicine, and most of those pharmacies are run by PBMs. And so we have a lot of independent pharmacies who have said, we are not going to be able to stock this medicine because there is a UPL on it. And we're very concerned because something I have brought up to our PDAB is what happens to a patient that only can take Enbrel. That is their only working medication. And here they're going to be non-medically switched. They're going to have to fight to get Enbrel if they can. There are going to be lots of different loopholes. And what happens if they get non-medically switched, go off Enbrel, and then end up having to go back on it, but then it doesn't work? Because this is something common when you're talking about drugs for rheumatoid arthritis and psoriatic arthritis. So these are very real issues that we are concerned about with the implementation of the UPL, not to mention that we as patients are not going to see any of those savings. We pay a price determined by our insurance company. And the UPL is not going to impact Medicare patients. It's not going to impact Medicaid patients or patients using TRICARE, because these are federal programs and our state PDAB cannot regulate those. So there's a very real concern that patients have because there's no stop button. There's no, hey, if this doesn't work, can we get a waiver so that we can get the brand name? No, that's not happening. So we are looking at this one drug that's getting a UPL that may influence the entire class of those drugs, and it's going to create problems for us as patients without any type of recourse. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we are very concerned about. I was so happy to see the white paper, and I sent it to every single legislator here in Colorado saying, you need to look at this, because here we are, we're also in a budget shortfall, a major budget shortfall, and spending all of this money, I think it's over $2 million to date on the PDAB, just seems incredibly unnecessary.
Well, thank you, Bridget. I think all three of you have brought up some really interesting issue areas. And, when we look at kind of PDAB as a whole, we often can see that the intentions were good to discuss and make more transparent the information on our healthcare costs. I've had conversations with policymakers, and they will look at me and say, really, that's all I really thought we would be doing here, is making it more transparent. And so that we have a better sense of what these costs are. But Bill, you and Jennifer have pointed out that that's not necessarily the case, that you're not just going to be transparently able to kind of hone in on what the costs are. And I think, was it Jennifer, you talked a little bit about the cost shifting that goes on into the services provided, the other things that have to be paid for by either the pharmacy or the practice, et cetera. And so, it's really much more complex and intertwined. So we do have a question from our participants on the call. And this is an interesting question. It doesn't necessarily have to do directly with the paper, but we'll get back to the paper as well through the question, I'm sure. Is who's really behind then this discussion around PDABs as a mechanism? Which organizations are advocating for PDABs? I'll turn that to any one of the three of you. And of course, you've heard me talk about this in the past before as well.
I know as a patient going into the PDAB, interesting experience. You know, I've been involved with our PDAB since they started the drug reviews. And whenever a patient has given feedback, they have accused us of being led by pharmaceutical companies because somehow we could not have concerns unless a pharmaceutical company rep got into my head and kind of trained me to have these particular concerns. But unfortunately, while they're worried about what the patient, you know, where their funding comes from, which, you know, with patients, we're just patients, they have not disclosed that they have been funded by not really, excuse me, they have been funded by very well off foundations like Arnold Ventures and the Arnold Foundation. And those foundations are giving very large donations to the groups that are behind these particular policies. And I'll let other people comment as well, but I do see a very big conflict of interest here.
Yeah, I find, you know, the whole question about who is funding what perspective to be uh, basically a smokescreen. You know, there are very important interest groups that support both sides of this very difficult policy question, which is, of course, always true. And what, you know, I think it would be most helpful to focus on is who is making the logical, rational point. You know, whoever the spokesperson is, whether it's a patient group that might have received a couple of $1,000s from a pharmaceutical manufacturer, or it's a passionate member of a PDAP board where that board's funding comes from an interested group of state legislatures through the appropriations process, or is the recipient of information that is funded from Arnold Ventures or others. The real question is who's right about these very difficult policy questions. And to the extent that folks point fingers at people who are motivated, like Bridget is, to do the right thing by patients, they're doing a disservice not just to Bridget, not just to her organization, though that is a pretty big disservice. It's also really a disservice to the important questions that are being posed here. And you know, we should focus on substance. And unfortunately, when we focus on substance, there are very significant reasons to be concerned. And I think Jennifer thinks, RAAP thinks, I think Bridget thinks that those concerns will be even more evident when we're in the first couple of months of Inflation Reduction Act implementation, because that really is the test case for what is proposed here. And we're going to get our first test run, and you know, we'll see where the facts go. I'm concerned that they're going to highlight the very problems that we're all articulating here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, PDABs are coming from a good place. I think that, you know, if you wanted to spend the money and look at cost review and analysis and look at that, look at the situation within your state about, you know, identifying the high cost drugs and which ones are unaffordable to patients, to the state, and you know, do the price and market data, that's all good work. But then what are you going to do with it? Like, so how are you going to change the actual price of something and make it more affordable to the state, make it more affordable to the patient? And that's where things sort of fall apart, because the healthcare system is so complex. The dollar flow between each individual stakeholder is complex. And I'm not just saying that, it really truly is. And we have built and exist in a system that is high cost, high rebate. And that's how everybody along the way makes the, you know, that's how the dollar flows, and it pays for the entire system. And if you're going to look at upper payment limits, they just don't work. If you do the math, it just doesn't save enough money, or may not save any money, and it'll just be soaked up by the payers. It's just not, it's not feasible.
Well,
I wish it was. I was like, maybe,
yeah,
maybe I'm going in this with the wrong attitude. Like maybe it actually could work.
yeah.
And it just
Well, I
doesn't.
mean, yeah, I mean, apropos of your point, the Colorado Insurance Association said you're right, right? I mean, quite an extraordinary development. They come out with their own paper and they say, yeah, this, more than likely is not going to translate to lower patient cost. That, in fact, is not what we think is going to happen with respect to this policy. So again, we can people can point fingers at who's getting money from where, but when the folks who traditionally are thought of as being on the other side from the manufacturer say, hey, the outcome of this policy probably is going to not be what you intended, that seems like a pretty important thing to focus on.
Absolutely.
You were about access, Bridget, as you pointed out. I mean, Colorado, so many independent pharmacies, and they just don't, they can't possibly, they just don't have the purchasing power of a chain. They can't afford to have, one-off losses because they are the one-off. And so, yeah, I think it's going to be, UPLs through implementation are just not the answer. And that I think pulls into question the PDAB in general, because you don't need data just to have data. You want to do something with it. And I don't think that there's a great answer for a PDAB what to do.
Yeah, in Colorado, they're generally focused on the fact that, hey, we have a state law that mandates that any savings go back to patients. And now that they've realized that we won't see any out of pocket savings, really, they have started to go into, well, we're going to be saving Coloradans on premiums. And my feeling is this is one drug. How are you going to save us money? All this does is give the insurance companies, the opportunity to say, oh yeah, we saved money with this, but everything else is going up. So, we could have charged you, $350 for a premium, but instead we're only charging 348.
Yeah,
You know,
and I don't even think they're going to say that, right? I mean, looking separately at the arc of premiums in the United States, right? They're not going to be able to say, oh, well, next year it's going to be better than this year.
yes.
So it really is a road to nowhere. I mean, I do find it to be remarkable that the very people that you would naturally expect in the flow of this kind of argument to be siding with the state and saying, yes, this is a great policy, or saying, don't really think it's going to achieve what you want it to achieve. That's of all the things that I've heard, that is the one that I have found the most telling.
So we do have another question. I think it will lead to some spirited discussion here. Is a question that has to do with how some of the concerns that you have raised and the paper raises, how has that been seen by members of the PDAB? In particular, the question is focused on Colorado and Bridget's experience. But again, we brought some of these concerns to other PDABs, so it may also be some discussion about how those PDABs react to this kind of information. So specifically, Bridget, if you'd like to start out and talk about how your questions and concerns, particularly around Enbrel, and the community's response on Enbrel with Colorado have been addressed by the PDAB. And then we can open that up to a little bit more broadly, how some other PDABs have reacted to these very same similar concerns.
So to date, I can say that the PDAB has not taken any of my concerns or any of the other patient concerns seriously. They have actually dismissed us, called us fear mongers, called us pharmaceutical representatives. And, these meetings are all recorded. So this is all there for people to see. They have gone out of their way to dismiss anything that they don't want to hear. And I don't feel like our concerns are taken seriously at all. As a matter of fact, it to date has felt like what they do is they listen to us because they have to, and then they just ignore everything. There have been no safety rails or guardrails put in place so that patients don't lose access. How they are monitoring all of this once the UPL does go into effect has not been put out there. And then what measures are they going to take if this fails? If this fails, how do they reverse it? The only thing they have in statute is a 60 to 90-day appeal of the UPL. And the UPL is not even going to go into effect after that decision between 60 and 90 days. It's going to be a lot longer than that. And so by the time we figure out what happens when we take all of the data, we look at the insurance, we look at the patients, it's going to be too late to reverse this. And the damage is going to be done. So at this point, I feel like this is more of a, we know that these medications are expensive and we just want to save the state money, despite the fact that this doesn't impact, the Medicaid and Medicare issues. So that's where I am with the patients. They have completely ignored me and have gone as far as to call us names.
It's interesting, Bridget, and I'd be interested in Bill and Jennifer's views as well. Is that, when I'm actually in front of a legislature at a hearing, or even going into meetings, I run into, or I go in arm with physicians and pharmacists, other patients, and we talk about some of these issues that we've talked about, particularly, physician payment. If they're stocking the drug in their practice, if they're administering that drug, and all the costs that are tied into the drug. It's not just the list price, right? And I was actually with a pharmacist, and we had met up outside an office, and he looked at me and he says, I often don't even know when I'm going to get paid when I provide a product, until after it goes through all the entire adjudication and system and chargebacks and this, that. And then finally I find out what I'm going to get paid, and I'm underwater. And then
Exactly.
I have no recourse if I'm underwater for a UPL product. And so those were some of the concerns that echo some of the concerns that we've talked about this morning that aren't being taken into account. And it's almost as if there's a little bit of naivete with some of the PDAB members, but also a willful not listening to these types of information. Bill and Jennifer, I'd be interested in some of your thoughts as well.
Jennifer, you want to start? Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I think unfortunately, we are suffering from two different problems that are interacting with each other. The first is that there is no such thing as a bias-free person. And the folks who are selected for PDABs are, of course, selected because they are supportive of the underlying assumptions as to why that policy should, in fact, be effective. And although I do think that some people who are advocates of this policy are looking with a sense of foreboding at what is coming down the rails for the Inflation Reduction Act, if you sort of are looking at the ecosystem, the policy ecosystem, people who were very strong supporters and very ardent and public supporters of the Inflation Reduction Act and Medicare negotiated price, and how they thought that it would work, have been strangely quiet over the last couple of months, right? Because it's begun to become clear that maybe it'll work, but maybe it won't work. And so you see in the ecosystem, the critics, people like me, being, much more vocal than supporters as we get closer and closer. So the second problem is that people who come to an issue with bias often are unwilling to revisit that bias until the facts become overwhelming.
Yeah.
And so we may need, unfortunately, to have a failure or two before people say, yeah, turns out that this was a more complicated problem in the definition than we understood it. And that's sad, but that's human nature.
Mhm. Uh, Bill, just to that point, how do you think the impact of New Hampshire will play into that? Where, of course, the legislature went back, looked at it, determined that it wasn't worth the spend, as Jennifer had said in her opening, that the savings weren't worth the investment and the effort.
Yeah. Well, there's nothing as effective as a convert. So I think that it could be quite effective, right? I mean, that's the things that often change people's views are once someone that they see as part of their group says, maybe we were wrong, or this is premature, or we didn't consider the problem fully. So, I think that that could be quite helpful. I mean, state legislation, as you know, probably better than anyone else, has a certain momentum to it. It moves from the drawing board to an individual state to multiple states, and it becomes its own ball that is rolling down a hill. But the ball can hit a tree and its course can be changed. And so I think New Hampshire could be an important moment. And I would encourage people on the side of PDAB advocates, as I have to encourage myself as a critic, to be aware and reactive to facts on the ground. Facts are sometimes terrible things for an advocate, but we all should in fact be obligated to struggle with them.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Bill. A question came in, and where have or have you had any responses? And I guess this would go to Bridget in particular, where you shared the paper and gotten a response. And have you received any objections or any feedback on responses that you may have gotten from legislative committees or staff or people that you forwarded the paper to? And then I can jump in after Bridget as well.
Right now, the paper has come out recently, so I think legislators are still mulling it over. However, I have been talking about these exact same things for about 2 years now in our legislature, and our legislators are starting to really become concerned because there's no oversight of the PDAB. They're not including the patients like they need to, and things are just not happening the way legislators thought this was going to happen. A lot of them misunderstood what a UPL was, and they thought this was going to impact our out of pocket costs. They're finding out that's not the case. So there's starting to be a lot more legislators that are questioning what's going on and whether or not this process is worth paying for. And I think really the budget cuts that most states are seeing are starting to really spark these discussions.
I would add to that, Bridget, a very similar experience. We've just started getting the paper into people's hands beginning in October, and now here we are at the end of September or August, sorry, and now we're at the beginning of September or beginning of October. Sorry.
Time
But,
moves fast, does it
I
not?
know. And then, but we had some really interesting discussions over the summer after we released the paper. And we spent some time with some of the supporters of PDAB actually this summer. And, shared with them some of the key themes from the paper, talked to them about some of the challenges for physicians and pharmacies, and particularly rare patients who often have to go to get their product from a specialty pharmacy out of state. That never will see the jurisdiction of the state they're in until it's drop shipped to that patient or to their provider. And what was interesting, just with some of those messages and themes, with some of these ardent supporters of PDAB was, a willingness to express some doubt
Hmm.
about PDAB and invitations for us to come and follow up with them this fall, which we are doing now actively. So it was, I don't know if the term is too strong, but PDAB exhaustion in a couple of states where they've been at this for 3 or 4 years and couldn't get past the legislature, or they're in a state where they're just kind of spinning their wheels and their PDAB really hasn't done much. And people are starting to say, well, what are we spending the money on? And so we have gotten some feedback using the messages from the paper, but I haven't gotten direct feedback on the paper itself yet, which we're hoping to get this fall, because a lot of those people we followed up with copies of the paper. So they've had it now for about a month, month and a half. So hopefully we'll be able to better answer this question in a few weeks.
Well, I think it's going to be effective. I think it's it substantively makes great points, but again, I just think it's written in the right spirit. It's written to the audience that needs to be convinced, and not in a way that says you're stupid.
No, I mean,
What were
but
you
Bill,
thinking?
you and I have been working on supply chain and made these issues for decades, and it's a hard thing to understand and to dive into. This is not, in a state legislature has lots of things, someone
Yes.
who's voting on this has lots of things they're worried about. It sounds good.
Mhm.
It just in execution, it doesn't work. And I know the system well enough to be able to say that.
Yeah. Well, I commend you and RAAP for, just bringing the right tone and focusing on the audience. And, this I'm sure won't in and of itself be the tree that stops the rock, but it can be certainly part of what leads people who stop thinking in absolutist terms and stop pointing fingers at people who are asking questions when they get to the moment of, this isn't quite going the way I thought it was. Why is that? It's a piece that is written for that person at that moment. And so that's exactly what was needed. And thanks for doing it.
Absolutely. I have to say, it's not that we're, can't have PDABs, we want expensive
Right.
medications. That's not the case at all. We all understand that affordability is a very real and complicated issue. And I commend people for trying to take that on. But we also want to be sure that the concerns are taken just as seriously as any positive outcome that they could have. There have been plenty of studies where the payers themselves have said, we're going to raise costs, and this is not going to impact what our patients pay out of pocket. And yet we still keep getting dismissed. And all we want really is to be sure that everything is taken seriously so that we can make sure that the patient, my community, is not the brunt of this. We don't feel the brunt of this because we always get stuck in the middle between policymakers, these ABC agencies, and insurance companies. And that's kind of what it feels like now.
No, I mean, unintended consequences are one thing, predictable consequences are another.
Mhm. Yes. And thank you for the back and forth comments on this, because as we look forward, and I know we're going to run out of time, so I just wanted to kind of tie back to Jennifer's comment at the beginning that this could be a very challenging week in terms of patient access. We've been getting feedback at the state level. We've seen it now occur in Nevada and in some other states where they're looking at some of the federal efforts as a default. So instead of potentially funding a complicated PDAB, which then 3, 4, 5 years later still hasn't done anything, why don't we put a mechanism in place where MFP or MFN, most favored nation, which we will see some of that potentially this week as well, where we have a market basket from OECD or other select countries, and that becomes a reference point for prices in Medicare or Medicaid. And maybe use those as surrogates. So we don't have to now take responsibility for a UPL. We just apply those more broadly than they're intended to the commercial marketplace. So I'd kind of like to end on that discussion because it will open up further webinars that we're going to have this fall on those two specific points. And Bill, I see you nodding the most. I'd like to turn a moment over to you.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's one of the points that we've been pressing on throughout this this conference call today. So those policies do tie together. They have a root that is common, and unfortunately, they are all based on the assumption that by creating a ceiling price with respect to certain individual products, that one can affect what stakeholders do throughout a complicated system, the point that Jennifer has been making. And unfortunately, all of those policies do not consider what the countermeasures will be inevitably of economically interested parties. And so they all have the ill of taking, as Jennifer would say, a very complicated problem and imposing an overly simplistic solution on that complicated problem without appreciating that, in fact, all of these stakeholders will then react to that policy using all of the levers that they can push. And so, yes, it's going to be messy. Because we see in multiple ways the same mistake being made over and over again.
Just magnified.
Unfortunately, yes.
Absolutely. It's like they're taking price caps from a model, an economic model we do not have here in the United States, and then trying to apply it in a very broad sense. And it's not going to end well.
Yeah, I was talking to a colleague this morning about potentially applying MFN as a default for PDABs, and basically the understanding that many emerging rare disease companies don't have the resources to launch in countries that have these price control policies in place. And if they do, they often license those products to bigger global players who have the infrastructure and could support those products, whether it's in Germany or Spain or France or Italy. And so now you have a situation where an emerging company may decide not to launch in Europe. Okay. But then they may also then license out to a larger company and then not be part of the price discussions, the negotiations, et cetera, and then have to compete against a price set by someone else.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've got really these dynamics that are in play that I don't think anyone is thinking through. And at the end of the day, what does that do to the US and US patients? Well, Jen actually did a study for RAAP when we were debating the IRA, and it looked at the reductions in pipelines and looked at the reduced investments. And Jennifer is I can see her kind of nodding a little bit because she hit it right on the head, because as soon as IRA was passed, we saw some closures. And IRA was actually, implicated in the closures of those rare programs. So, the reality is it comes full circle on the patient, as Bridget described.
Yeah, it does. I couldn't agree more. So my rare disease, we have what we hoped will be our first therapy within a year and a half, 2 years. Looking at the landscape, it seems very highly unlikely that therapy is going to be available outside of the United States at all.
Yes, look, I'm terrified.
Yeah, I mean, that's seems the most likely outcome when one looks at the incentives.
My
And,
rare disease is just now starting to become trendy and popular. So we are just getting the basic research,
yeah,
and I have no therapies right now. And my main concern is that because of all of this, we're not going to get them. We're finally starting to get research, and people looking at how we can treat my rare disease. But unfortunately, I think this is just going to put up more roadblocks.
Yep.
yeah, and people dismiss, the concerns. Well, people outside of the United States won't get access to therapy. This should be an American question. Well, it is the full circle, Michael, that you're talking about. If in fact now when a product is launched, it's launched basically for the US market, well, then that's a much less attractive market, or at least a less attractive market. And it means less investment in any and all diseases, because the market has now been truncated in a fashion that doesn't support the clinical trial research programs that are necessary. So it does have a negative effect here in the United States. And that's very sad, but that is unfortunately where we're headed. We had a trial that had results just at the edge of what would be a statistically significant outcome. And I don't fault them, but that sponsor said, nope, I'm not going to redo the study, not going to do it. And they didn't ascribe it to the IRA and the impact of the IRA. So it's speculation on my part, but do I think that at least some part of their decision was, gee, our window post-launch is already closing in on us, and we see the direction of all of these other policies. Is this a place to invest? I think this was part of it.
Wow. Well, on a positive note, um, we are engaged early for the 2026 legislative cycles. We have a terrific paper. We have a terrific team and partnerships across patient organizations and alliances and physicians and pharmacists. So hopefully, as we prepare for 2026, we'll be able to articulate some of these complexities and then offer solutions that truly can lower patient out-of-pocket costs today. And I think, if that remains our focus, positively to be part of the solution, again, hopefully stakeholders will continue to invite us to the table. And at the end of the day, we'll get better policy. And so that's my hope, coming from all this complexity and all this concern that we talked about with PDAB and MFN and MFP, that the key message is to remain engaged, to be a positive voice, to talk about the implications, to be vocal and direct, but then offer solutions. And so hopefully, as our organization and others move forward, we'll be seen as part of that bridge into a place where we can do positive things for patients.
Absolutely.
So with that, thank you to all of you. And thank you to everyone who participated and all the wonderful questions. We sure appreciate your participation as well. The upcoming webinar will be scheduled in October, and we will be talking about the pivot to MFN and MFP, two acronyms that many of you on the call will become very familiar with as we approach the state legislative sessions in 2026. So again, thank you to our panel, and thank you to all of you.